Thank you all very much. Is the mic working? Good, good, okay. Go through this a little bit quickly. I do want to have a Q&A, and I'm actually just trying to work on this approach a little bit, so this will be a good, I think, semi-trial run. I won't, as the title suggests, and I intended it to, we are not yet free. We are not yet equal. We have not yet transcended all the gross errors inflicted by enslavement. And yet films like Django and Lincoln are intentionally created to make it appear as though we have overcome something, to justify the moment. So usually I spend a lot more time talking about what I just try to simplify is the power struggle, and go through some details about what are the actual conditions of different communities, particularly Black America, despite popular claim to improvement. But just for now, just simply to say, suffice it to say that we are in a power struggle that is ongoing. We have not fully achieved any revolution. We have not fully achieved an overthrow of all the structures that lead to the kinds of gross and worsening inequality that we see today. Things are actually getting worse and worse by the day, yet my argument is that films like these discourage us from recognizing that, or encourage us to recognize that only through the lens of, well, at least it's better than it was, or if Black people are not fully equal, it is because of some flaws in their character, as opposed to any structures that inhibit actual genuine equality. I do think more bluntly, it is important to say that white supremacy and capitalism are still at work. Imperialism and colonialism are still at work. And that's why you have wider gaps in wealth and income today than ever. And anyway, so we'll come back to some of that in a little bit. I wanted to start with something I've been trying to keep up with and catch up to that Patricia Bradley wrote about a little over a decade ago, and used what she describes as the metaphor of slavery, which she more or less defines as a propaganda tool used by white settlers in early U.S. Just obviously before the so-called revolution, to represent the level at which the British regarded the American colonists, not a commitment to abolition, but rather to transfer into the new republic long-standing white attitudes towards Black colonists. And what she talks about in a very detailed fashion in this book is that very early on in this country, particularly if anybody drinks Sam Adams or got a kick out of Chappelle's Sam Jackson and Sam Adams routine, most of us are not really aware of who actually Sam Adams was. And so I've now stopped drinking his beer, and I don't even want to associate with it, because the dude, he was not only a slave owner, but he was one of the earliest propagandists who would use in his writings this metaphor of slavery. So in other words, to say slavery, true slavery, could only be recognized vis-a-vis the way whites were treating other whites. And they could then use it to ignore and, of course, not make free the enslaved African people that they were still holding themselves. So slavery in the press, so slavery in the press as it regarded African people was wiped out, was ignored, and only mentioned to talk about how white settlers needed to free themselves from the bondage of enslavement at the hands of the British. And what I'm trying to argue is that baseline use of the metaphor, in particular how it played out in the media, still is carried out today. So the metaphor established and today maintains a collective white solidarity in relation to an established low standard of African enslavement and Black natal alienation, social death, and non-humanity. Something I'm actually trying to catch up to through the work of Jared Sexton and Frank Wilderson, which they are working through from the classic text, Slavery and Social Death, from Orlando Patterson, which more or less gives a global assessment of slavery, of all the different forms of slavery, and isolates the particular anti-Black, anti-African variety that happened here and that still influences the way we interact with one another to this day. And basically what I'm just trying to say here is that because Black people in this country were started at the low standard of enslavement, everything since then can be seen as an improvement. But as Malcolm X said, if a person plunges a knife 9 inches in your back and pulls it out 6, they don't deserve to be thanked.
That's right.
So for me, the fact that you could say that my life is better than my enslaved foreparents doesn't make me feel any better. That doesn't do me any good. And you don't get any credit for that. Because by what standard do we, anyway, what kind of cruddy society would use that as a standard to determine how well or not we're treating somebody? But what they're also talking about is a very, I think, powerful and difficult concept. And as Frank Wilderson says all the time, he struggles to not think about it so much because of the depth and the pain associated with it. But what is meant by natal alienation is that in enslavement, a black child was not the property or the familial relation to their parents. They were the property of white owners. And this created, and still to this day, sets the relationship of not being a human being. You're not a human being. You're not connected to your parents. You are socially dead. You are not a human. And to this day, that is used to justify, the continued oppression of black people. And this is something that Patricia Bradley was talking about in this metaphor of slavery, that the other component of it was that it permanently inscribed a rationale for black inequality. And as they started to promote in that early Sam Adams press moment, something we still hear to this day. No one is enslaved or abused who isn't deserving of it. So to this day, we hear about, well, black people I know, we have the lowest, the longest term unemployment rate since 1948. We still have the same 0.1% of the nation's wealth that we had in 1860. There are more black people in prison than were held as slaves at 1860. You hear about all this stuff, you're like, well, but they kind of deserve it. Look how we depict them. And even when somebody comes to honestly try to deliver some message about it, we sit in the back of the room and text and talk during the presentation. Because at the end of the day, who cares about these monkeys, niggers, and savages that we see on TV who make us laugh every once in a while in a movie or something, but are really not fully human? So in terms of mass media and the press, the metaphor of slavery demands that African and black agency cannot be depicted. So hence Django's exceptionalism. The white male lead is benefactor who defines the limits of black freedom, and the non-mention at all of black abolitionists or Frederick Douglass and Lincoln. In other words, and we'll come back to this hopefully a little bit later, these films can only talk about issues regarding enslavement or violent rebellion to enslavement through the lens of white male elite beneficence. In that scene in Django, who saw Django? Okay. That scene in Django where DiCaprio is talking about exceptional. Exceptional? He's not exceptional. He's a non-exceptional nigger. Now, the way the film, the sort of depth and the play that they have with history in this film is that we're meant to believe that Django's rebellion and his resistance and the violence associated with it was in fact exceptional, rare. They even say in the film, niggas don't ride horses, which of course by the late 19th century, everybody knew black people were the most proficient horse riders, cowboys, etc., and would use horseback riding in their rebellions. But in the movie, oh my God, this is so crazy. And in part because we are not meant to see black people involved in their own liberation struggles on their own terms. That history has been omitted from beginning to today. And then of course in Lincoln, Douglass isn't even mentioned. They don't even mention him to say something about him without paying a black actor to actually portray him. They don't even just say like, and Douglass is out there, blah, 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 blah. He's completely ignored. And we're meant to believe that nice white men argued with less nice white men to determine how free black people should be. And by the end of the movie, we're meant to be like, oh man, Thaddeus Stevens and Lincoln, thank you so much. Thank you. And then he even lets his black, whatever she's supposed to be, read the 13th Amendment as if like, look what I've given to you. It's absurd. Okay. So again, I just pretty much covered this. Django is said to be the exceptional nigger in his rebelliousness, and then non-exceptional, of course, in his inferiority as an African. And this cinematic trope just denies the history and impact of insurrection and follows consistent and persistent media press patterns in dealing with rebellion. So, well, I wanted to add just a few things about that those in the white South were more than well aware of, particularly by the 1850s when Django was supposed to have happened. This is just a brief list of more than 55 African rebellions on the ships before even getting anywhere. And this is just an abbreviated list of 55 incidents from 1699 to 1845. So the idea that black people were not in open rebellion on a regular basis once they got to where they got is of course belied by the fact that before they even got anywhere, they were already fighting. And one important piece about this that it was often enslaved women who led it or sparked it because they were given more freedom to move around the ship and would often sneak things to people and give information to people that would inspire this kind of rebelliousness. But of course, because we're meant to be told we are deserving of this treatment, we're not supposed to know that we resisted at all. And I was saying in a class earlier, if anybody saw the movie The Debt, anybody see that movie? Yes. There's a scene, it's about Jews enacting retribution against Nazis after the Second World War. And they capture this Nazi, and they've tied him up, and they want to turn him over to the Israeli authorities, and he starts to try to goad one of them into being upset. And he says, "Do you know why it was so easy for us to kill all of you? Because you are punks, you're cowards, you don't resist. Even when you see us putting your children in ovens, you don't resist, you don't do anything." And it's meant to promote a myth that is extended, of course, beyond Jews and into African descendants that you didn't even resist it, so of course you deserve it. Now, of course, even in terms of Jewish history, that's a lie. There were a number of violent rebellions and responses, but we're not meant to, we're not supposed to see that either. And then certainly, as was said here by one authority, the desire for freedom on the part of the African, evidenced by his struggle on the slave ships, did not die in the New World. It's a longer quote, but the point is that they were fighting incessantly. Okay. And more, I just wanted to actually, fill this presentation with this discussion, because as Eugene Genovese once famously wrote, the slaves of the United States faced a highly unfavorable relationship of forces which shifted away from revolt and toward other forms of resistance. Brazilian slaves frequently found conditions conducive to armed struggle and rebelled more often, but the Caribbean region constituted one grand theater of recurring warfare, declared and undeclared. In part, this is important because this impacted black people here. They were very well aware of what was happening in the Caribbean. They were very well inspired by the Haitian Revolution as one example, and were very much inspired to enhance their rebelliousness. So by the end of the 18th century, 100 years before this movie Django was supposed to be occurring, the context of slave revolts in this country shifted decisively from attempts to secure freedom from slavery to attempts to overthrow slavery as a social system. Now, this is important because what does Django show you? This is one man with his white male rich benefactor trying to save one person. All the rest of it is ancillary, collateral. If I free a couple of them, good, but that's not really the point. But by the 1850s, most of the rebelliousness was about we're freeing everybody. Everybody's getting free. And this is an important point because we're not meant to be inspired today to work collectively or to think collectively. Get mine. I'm going to get mine. And then, and then that line that Jay-Z keeps, how can I help the poor if I'm one of them? That kind of stuff. That's just absurd nonsense. It's collective struggle that makes change. But we're not encouraged to see it that way. So again, media had the goal to limit black inspiration and duplication of these acts, as well as to limit white fear and to preserve their self-concept. Because an important part of all of this is how an identity of whiteness was created in direct opposition to blackness and slavery. So having this black, savage, non-human allows all white people to unify in their collective treatment of so-called colored folks. So this is just a quote from one of the newspapers of the time. No, that's not actually. From one of the histories, I think this is still Genovese. The outstanding threat, maybe it's not actually, the state, I should have put it up there, now I don't even remember where I got it. The outstanding threat of insurrection in the state was the Denmark-Vesey plot of 1822. The leader, Denmark, was a free Negro from Charleston, St. Thomas, West Indies, who had purchased his freedom in 1800 from the proceeds of a lottery. He desired to emulate leaders of San Domingo, or what we now know of as Haiti, to win freedom for his people. He could have stayed free by himself, but he wanted freedom for everybody. And as they quote from one of the newspapers, or one of the conversations between the governor and our favorite president, Thomas Jefferson, he says the Gabriel plot is unquestionably the most serious and formidable conspiracy we have ever known of the kind. While it was possible to keep secret, which it was till we saw the extent of it, we did so. And the point again is, we have to deny the amount of rebelliousness. We don't want to acknowledge it. We don't want to scare white people. We don't want to encourage black people to do the same thing. And to this day, we don't have really time to get into it, but if you look at the coverage of Christopher Dorner, if you look at the coverage of Omar Thornton, if you look at the coverage of Lavelle Mixon, if you look at the coverage of even, what's my man's name, Cho at the University of Virginia, none of what they said were their underlying reasons for engaging in their violent acts were ever considered. In fact, what I thought was most telling about the Omar Thornton case, I don't know if you're familiar, he went to his job, and I believe it was Connecticut, and shot and killed as many white people at the job as he could. When he calls in the police, he's saying to them, this is a racist place, this is why I did this. And then what was most telling about the coverage and the way they erased him from the discussion was that his white girlfriend and her mother said he was not racist or violent. He was pushed to this by white people. And that's what I thought was the key there. That's why, if his girlfriend was black, would have been even easier to talk about. Right. It was the fact that she was white and saying that he was not racist or violent that erased that discussion. So we're not allowed, so instead they don't want to obviously talk about, well, why would Gabriel Prosser want to rebel? Why? What's the problem? Same thing today. Why would Christopher Dorner do what he did? Why should we even consider what he was saying? Just judge the action, and the action was a violent assault against the first wing of defense of this nation, which is the police. Has to be discarded, has to be erased. I put this whole quote up here because Ishmael Reed, in a brilliant article on the subject, makes a point that I want to at least highlight here, or at least touch on very quickly, about Django. Tarantino, despite the history of black resistance, apparently believes that progress for blacks has been guided by an elite, which doesn't explain the hundreds of revolts throughout this hemisphere, which weren't guided by German bounty hunters, nor Abraham Lincoln, nor a talented 10th Negro. Judging from his letters, the revolt in Haiti scared the blank out of Thomas Jefferson and his friends. Arna Bontemps wrote about the revolt led by slave Gabriel in Black Thunder, a great book, by the way. But this novel, like most fiction written by black males, won't reach the screen, nor will Margaret Walker's Great Jubilee. And if these classics did, they wouldn't receive the kind of promotion this movie has received, nor did Spike Lee's movie about the heroic efforts of black soldiers who fought in Italy during World War II, The Miracle at St. Anna. It only played at one Oakland theater at 10:30 p.m. Those who objected to a black soldier having an Italian girlfriend will probably enjoy the role played by Kerry Washington. Scant isn't the word. Her lines total about 2 paragraphs, and she wanders through the film, either grimacing in pain, weeping, or modeling a yellow dress in Django's fantasy. A waste of talent. So again, if we're going to talk about black rebellion at all, it's got to be in the context or through the lens of a white man who writes about it with a white leader, white benefactor. Ishmael Reed also points out the fact that the film was dishonestly promoted. It was promoted as a black film starring black people, but it's really not a black film, and it really does not star black people. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that the only 2 awards that were given to it were given to the screenwriter and Christoph Waltz, who's supposed to get it for supporting actor, please. They only did that so they could give my man the Lincoln Best Actor and get them both. Call him a supporting actor. Now this is part of the quote that I think, this quote alone is why I think Frederick Douglass was not mentioned in Lincoln at all, which is, again, now Lincoln is a movie about the passage of the 13th Amendment. It's not about any other part of his history, which is a lot more sordid, dishonestly talked about. And if we have time, we can maybe talk about how bad a human being Lincoln actually was. But Douglas said in 1865, I take this ground, whether this constitutional amendment is law or not, whether it has been ratified by sufficient number of states to make it law or not, I hold that the work of abolitionists is not done. Even if every state in the Union had ratified that amendment while the black man is confronted in legislation by the South by the word white, our work as abolitionists, as I conceive it, is not done. What advantage is a provision like the amendment to the black man if the legislature of any state can tomorrow declare that no black man's testimony shall be received in a court of law? Where are we then? Any wretch may enter the house of a black man and commit any violence he pleases. Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. And I think if he lived long enough, he would agree with me that that's also not true, but we'll come back to that too. That was the argument, and they were right. They might have employed the Negro to fight for them, and while they retained in their hands power to exclude him from political rights, they could have reduced him to conditions similar to slavery. They would not call it slavery, this is my favorite part, but some other name. Slavery has been fruitful in giving itself names. It has been called the peculiar institution, the social system, the impediment. It has been called a great many names, and it will call itself by yet another name, and you and I and all of us had better wait and see what new form this old monster will assume, in what new skin this old snake will come forth. Good Lord. Now how are you going to have that in a movie that's supposed to be praising these beneficent white men for freeing black people? So you just ignore them. Don't even mention them by name. And as Howard Zinn used to say, omission is worse than lying. Because if I lie to you, I at least give you something you can follow up on through research. If I leave Frederick Douglass out altogether, you don't even know to go look it up. And then you never gets caught. One other semi-long quote that I had to put in this. Yeah, that's priceless, man. I can't take credit for the picture. I just Googled that. I don't know where but that's dope. But this is why, now, in a 1968 debate between Ossie Davis and William Styron, who had published shortly before then The Confessions of Nat Turner, which completely distorts the history of Nat Turner. They had this debate, and Ossie Davis was, oh man, he was incredibly skillful in dealing with this. And this is the point that I think is why ultimately we have to reject Django, even if we like it. Because I know a lot of people say they like it. But this is why we have to reject it. So he says, I have often wondered, and I imagine you have too, how such an important book as Uncle Tom's Cabin, creating a character, Uncle Tom, who Mr. Lincoln said was one of the causes of the Civil War, should ultimately wind up being despised and hated by black people. Even black people who have never read this book know that Uncle Tom is bad. How did this happen? Miss Harriet Beecher Stowe certainly had no axe to grind against black people. She was by no means a racist. Her intention really was to alleviate the conditions of black men and women in our country. And yet somehow we came to hate and despise Uncle Tom. There are two reasons, and they are relevant to what we're talking about tonight. One is that Uncle Tom, for all his great values, was given to us and did not grow out of our own experience. We did not create him. He came from someone else. The second and far more subtle point was that Uncle Tom's characteristics were created basically to elicit the sympathy of white community who had the power to do something about his condition. This was because Uncle Tom couldn't do it himself. Now, we've had two kinds of heroes in our country, two kinds of black heroes, both who were modeled on Uncle Tom. Those who did not have the power to change their condition and had only the power of their own morality, goodness, and their sanctity to make white people guilty enough to change it. And there was the other kind, the outsider, the rebel, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, guys like Marcus Garvey, the outsiders, the Malcolm X's, who never compromised, who never felt that the white man should be made to feel guilty, who never felt that they had to rely on white power for whatever it was that needed to be done. And this is ultimately, it's not a perfect comparison in the sense that Django is at least meant to attack our psyche as if he was Turner, Vesey, Prosser, or Malcolm X. But in reality, he is the first kind and that we should reject, because Django, the character, doesn't come from us. He doesn't come from black history. He doesn't come from black struggle. He doesn't come from a black perspective. He comes from the mind's eye of a very questionable Quentin Tarantino. And I think ultimately this is why it puts so many limits on what the true story of a Django should have been. Why haven't we had cinematic portrayals of Turner, Vesey, or Prosser? If you want action, you want the bloodshed, you want all of that, you could have that and more in these films. But we're not allowed to get it because it has to come through the lens and through the story of white male leadership. Now, this is where we wanted to switch over here. I just want to show you one quick piece. Because Bell Hooks, she's so dope, man. She already blew Tarantino out the box years ago. We just didn't listen. So
if I had talked about Spike Lee filmmaking before he made Girl 6, I would really be assessing him very differently from my assessment of him after he's made Girl 6, because I find Girl 6 to be a movie that not only challenges Hollywood, I feel that it's a critical read on Hollywood. I mean, that moment in the opening of the film when you have Quentin Tarantino saying that he's going to make the best black film.
Okay, this movie is going to be big, bigger than big, huge. Greatest romantic African-American film ever made. Directed by me, of course.
I mean, that was such a deconstructive moment where Spike Lee was saying, this is what blackness has come to mean in Hollywood. It doesn't have anything to do with what color the person is. It's a certain image of blackness that Hollywood finally believes can be negotiated by any cultural maker.
We're looking for the range of Angela Bassett. We're looking for the total game, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Black people aren't needed to produce black cinematic culture because white people can produce that culture. And there's a lot of critiques.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, but that's the basic, that's enough of the point. I think that's the point. And also she says, movies do not just mirror the culture of a given time, they also create it. So they're not only creating the historical memory, these films, but they're creating, I would argue, if I understand her correctly, or at least I would at least argue this, that they're creating our current moment as well, how we should interpret not only our history, but our current moment and how we relate to one another. So just to wrap this up very quickly, I sort of touched on some of this already. What I mean by false transcendence is the persistence of enslavement. The 13th Amendment does not end slavery, it legalizes it. It just means you have to be convicted of a crime first. That's what the amendment actually says. So slavery is still legal and still in practice, and in fact in greater numbers based on the prison population than the plantation system, and more profitable too, by the way. And there's less resistance to it than under the old system. Real-life Djangos are still imprisoned as political prisoners. If we really like Django, we really want to honor Django, we should free Mumia, we should free Leonard Peltier, we should free Sundiata Acoli, we should free Marshall Eddie Conway, we should let Assata Shakur come home with a parade and honor and apologies and reparations. I mean, these are the things, like the people who took on the mantle of a Malcolm or a Django are punished in prisons to this day. So let's not talk about how much we love the movie and love the history and blah, 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 without connecting it to what's going on now. We're also, in much a similar way, meant to ignore the history of the Black Liberation Movement, the Black Liberation Army. If I showed you a list of armed rebelliousness that existed during the so-called civil and human rights struggle that's popularly summarized by Dr. King, it would look just like that slave ship revolt list. We just did an interview with Dhoruba Ben Wahad, who was locked up for 19 years for being in the BLA. He's still very much alive. Nobody wants to talk to him. Nobody wants to include him in their discussion because his analysis and the prescribed actions are too troubling. Prescribed responses. So of course, by 2040, as it's been reported, we will be in officially the new apartheid country. This is why all these things I think are still important. We will have a white minority that will have overwhelming control over the resources and the wealth, just like in current South Africa. And historical South Africa, by the way, it didn't change much actually. And we already have, as Joe Torres and Juan Gonzalez have talked about, an apartheid media, a very separate, segregated media system that does not allow these kinds of conversations to occur more honestly. Then Black America's permanent recession. Black America has been described as being such a horrific economic state that even before this most recent crisis, it was called a permanent recession. So the ravages of these things are still happening. And then as my comrades in the Malcolm X grassroots movement put out last year in their report, every 36 hours in this country, a black man or woman is killed by the police. This does not count Latinos, indigenous people, or any other so-called people of color, just African Americans. Every 36 hours. So for all the excitement over Trayvon Martin or Oscar Grant, this goes on every 36 hours. In part because of this, the relationship, the permanent relationship inscribed since enslavement of a non-humanity of black people. I do have to very quickly plug my new book. So if you are interested in this same argument applied to Manning Marable's book about Malcolm X that came out about a little more, well, actually 2 years ago now, you can get our book. And it just deals with all the inaccuracies. I won't go into it now. But I have to at least mention it. The publisher will get upset if I don't do it, and we don't get a lot of coverage. So it is called A Live Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. A collective of authors have come together to really explain what happened in that Manning Marable book and why it had to happen so that the same thing, same argument, so that today we don't pick up what Malcolm really said or really did. We don't certainly organize the way he did, and we don't respond the same way he was asking us to the conditions that he was facing that are actually worse today. And then very lastly, why is propaganda or the metaphor of slavery so important? As Frantz Fanon said, because the settler's work is to make even dreams of liberty impossible for the native. And the native's work is to imagine all possible methods for destroying the settler. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope we have time for some Q&A.